So, what am I doing in front of a beauty supply store and a haircut place? Well, what if I told you that 2,500 years ago, there was a young woman who was created by God to be one of the most beautiful women on the planet, and because of how He created her beauty, she in the end saved the nation of Israel and also preserved the ability for the Messiah to be born. This young woman who, because of her beauty, everything changed. Actually, it was her beauty plus, well, the beauty supplies, just like at the store. Stay tuned, I'll tell you more about it. I'm trying to stay away from the cars that are driving around me right now. So this would be documentary evidence if I get hit by a car. So who am I talking about when I talk about this young woman? Well, some of you, especially if you're in the Women's Bible Study, know who I'm talking about. Some of you may be actually quite clueless about it. So I want to talk about her today for a couple of reasons. One is because today on the calendar, the day that I'm recording this, it's actually the day in the United States when she is celebrated across the country. Yeah, sorry, I just had to check something. She's celebrated for what she did from the story in the Bible. The other one is I want to be able to talk about the fact that narratives in the Bible can have such extraordinary impact on our lives, like we're studying about Elijah and Elisha right now. So I wanted to do that. And as well, it answers the question in life, after we come to the Lord, what are we still doing here? In fact, what are we needed for? And in the case of this young woman, her very innocent, one-time action of her entire life has a huge and impactful impact on all of history according to God's providential design. That can be us as well. So let's take a look at her story for a second. We go all the way back to Persia, 2,500 years ago. I gotta wait for the traffic now again because there's people traveling all around me. That's kind of a bummer. But we go back to 2,500 years ago into Persia, which is today, present day Iraq. Oh, nice dogs. Present day Iraq and Iran. And back during those days, 2,500 years ago, there were a lot of Jews that had been taken away in the Babylonian captivity that were in Persia at this time. And they weren't slaves, but they were exiles. So this woman that was raised up, I'll call her Hadassah. Hadassah ends up being pivotal in the history, but she is actually an exile in Israel, in Persia at the time. And as of exile, she's actually a minority there. She's not really honored as such. She's also there with her guardian, her cousin, whose name is Mordecai, and she is cared for by him because her parents are dead. So here's the story. The king of Persia at the time loses his queen. Actually, he dequeens her. I don't know if you can call it dequeening, but he dequeens her. And in the dequeening, he suddenly realizes that he has no queen. Now, that's a pretty obvious statement to make, but he has no queen. And his courtiers say, hey, what a great opportunity. You can just, what do you say you have a beauty pageant and bring in all the most beautiful women across the entirety of Persia, which, by the way, extends at this time in history from Ethiopia all the way over to India. So that's what they do. They put out an announcement. It's kind of like a Cinderella story in many respects like that. Puts out an announcement, and these women are kind of thinned out until it comes down to 7 or 8 women. And in this group of seven or eight women is Hadassah, the Jew. And her cousin, guardian, says, listen, if this goes well, don't tell anyone you're a Jew, okay? Because we're sort of persecuted and we're a minority here. So that's what happens. She gets in this last group, and then they decide to have kind of a beauty pageant to figure out who the next queen's going to be. So they give them a year to get ready for this beauty pageant, and what they do is they sequester them in a harem for a year. 6 months in that time, they're primping with the oil of myrrh, is what they say, and then for the other 6 months, we're looking at spices and ointments. So for 12 months, she gets a chance to get ready, and then finally the day comes, and what they need to do is visit the king one at a time, and then the king will make his choice. Well, guess what? He likes Hadassah and decides to marry her and make her the queen of Persia, Hadassah, secretly a Jew, and she's keeping her secret all this time just to make sure that nothing happens. Well, Hadassah's chosen. There's a feast. There's a tax refund that goes to everybody. There's gifts to everybody. It's just extraordinary time, and everyone happily lives ever after. Well, not exactly. It turns out that her guardian cousin Mordecai, he wants to make sure she's being taken care of, so he constantly visits the front gates of where she lives with the king, looking for information and maybe even meeting with her to find out how she's doing. One time he's at those gates trying to figure out if life is good for his cousin and the person he's taking care of. He's there and he hears a plot to take over the king, to kill the king and have a coup. So he decides, oh my gosh, I got to do something about this. He gets word from that outside gate. He sends word by note into Hadassah, his cousin, says, listen, you got to do something about this and warn the king. She does indeed warn the king. The king is warned. He arrests those two guys, has them hanged, and then the court historian writes down in this book the histories of everything that goes on in the kingdom, about these two guys, about how they were hanged, and that had Mordecai by name as the guy who had basically given the news in to do that. Well, that's a predicate to the rest of the story right here. Well, things go on. Life happens for Hadassah as the queen, and then suddenly this guy named Haman is elevated politically in the kingdom under the king. Haman's a pretty nasty guy in all respects, but one day out at that outer gate, Haman, who demands that people bow down to him, comes across Mordecai out there, and Mordecai, the secret Jew, will not do it, and it just really ticks off Haman. And from that point on, he hatches a plan to kill all the Jews that are in exile in Persia, to kill all of them. And so that's what he decides to do. He discusses it with the king. The king gives him a signet ring for his authority to do just exactly that very thing. And they send out these orders throughout the entirety of Persia, which says on the 13th of the month, you are allowed to kill any Jew that's in the land with impunity, and we will not protect them. And that order goes out. Now, of course, Mordecai, the uncle, the protector cousin, actually, he's the son of her uncle, but he hears about this plan and wonders whether or not Hadassah knows about this, because her people are all going to be killed. So he sends word in to Hadassah, who's the queen now, and says, listen, you've got to do something about this. Well, after a little hemming and hawing, she decides that she will, and she goes to the king. She busts into his presence and says, basically, King, I have something to talk to you about, but let's do it over lunch today. So she invites him to a feast that day and says, also, bring this guy Haman with you. So she invites the king and Haman come for a lunch. They get together. You'd think she would blow the news right there and say, King, this guy's going to kill all of my people, including me. I'm a Jew. But she doesn't do it. She loses her nerve. And basically she says, tell you what, let's have lunch again tomorrow. And when we have lunch again tomorrow, then, then we can talk about something I have on my mind. So they break up that particular feast. And Haman actually leaves the feast feeling very honored. Like, listen, I was invited to a feast that only the king and the queen were to, and I was included as well. But by the time he gets home, it becomes apparent to his wife and to his family that he's still really miffed about the fact that the Jews and this Mordecai guy, they have really disrespected him, and that's just not right. And so something should be done about that. So what happens is that he goes home, and when he's talking about this with his family says, listen, we got a suggestion for you. Just go ahead and build a gallows to hang Mordecai right at our house here. Build a gallows overnight, and then tomorrow morning, all you got to do is just walk into the king's presence and say, hey, listen, I'd like to kill this guy. Would that be okay? I've already got some gallows, and it'll work out just fine. So he does. He decides that night to go ahead and build the gallows. He builds the gallows, has them all done by morning. Now, meanwhile, the king is doing a little bit of late night reading. If he had a television, he'd be watching The Late Show or something like that. But he's doing some late night reading. And what he's reading is this history book of the Chronicles of the Kingdom. And he's reading through it, and it gets to the part about Mordecai being the guy who discovered the plot against him, wherein then the king hung these two guys. Well, he thinks for a second and says, hey, did we ever honor this Mordecai guy? I mean, did we ever actually do anything nice for him? So he goes to bed. The next morning, he wakes up to having Haman coming into his presence, and Haman's on his way just to ask again, like he thought about the night before by the prompting of his wife. He's going to ask if we can just hang this guy Mordecai. Well, before he gets a chance to ask that question, the king says to him, "Hey, what do we do to honor someone in our kingdom?" And of course Haman responds and says, "Well, normally what we do is we take the guy, we put a robe on him that the king has worn, we put him on a horse that the king has ridden, and we give him a crown that the king has worn, and then some high-placed authority in the king's command takes the horse by the rein and walks him through town and proclaims to everyone, this is what the king does to honor those who honor him and do good for him." And the king says, "Great, that's a great idea. Let's do that. Tell you what, Haman, would you do that for me? Would you, keep the reins of the horse and get my robe and get my crown and do all this for this guy by the name of Mordecai?" The very same guy that Haman was coming in to ask if he could hang him. Oh, the mortification of it all. So anyway, well, it happens, and Haman doesn't let loose of the fact that this is the very same guy that he hated and wanted to actually go and hang at his house that morning. He walks Mordecai through town and says, this is how the king honors someone like this. Humiliating. So by that afternoon, the second feast happens. The feast that Hadassah said, "I want to have this feast." She has the feast. The king is invited. Haman comes after walking her cousin around town in honor. Haman, the king, and Hadassah, and finally the king says, "So what was on your mind?" And what she says is, "An extermination order went out to kill my people. I'm a Jew, and that's not right." And the king asks, "Who would do such a thing like this? Who would do this?" And she looks across at the guy on the other side of the table, and she says, "Him." She says of him, "This wicked Haman." Well, to make a long story short, Haman's immediately hung on the very same gallows that he had built the night before to hang Mordecai. And he's hung right there, and everything is taken care of. The end of the story? Well, not quite. It turns out that at that point then, Hadassah introduces her cousin, her guardian, Mordecai, to the king. The king is so pleased to meet Mordecai, and the fact that he himself is actually related to the queen, Hadassah, that he puts him in very high honor, almost in the same position that Haman has, and even takes Haman's property, gives it to the queen, and the queen gives it to Mordecai to take care of and to be the entruster. The king gives him his signet ring. I mean, he gives him all this power and all this authority, almost exactly like Haman. And now Mordecai is in the family, and he's highly exalted in the house of the king. Then suddenly, Hadassah realizes that the edict is still out around the kingdom, and the kingdom's huge, and on the 13th, all the Jews are going to be slaughtered, even though the author of the order has now been killed himself. We've got to stop this, and time is wasting. So in very quick fashion, the king puts together a communique, writes it up, and has it sent by horseback all over the kingdom. And in that communique, what it says is this. It says, if you are a Jew and someone attacks you, you are allowed by law to defend yourself and kill those who were trying to kill you, which they couldn't do before. And so that gets sent out at rapid speed. And then also Hadassah asked, can we extend the day for this order to be active, not just the 13th day of the month, but how about the next day also, the 14th? That way we'll make sure everything is taken care of. So sure enough, the decree goes out by horseback just in the nick of time. And yes, indeed, the Jews defend themselves. It's not a great massacre of the Jews, but it is a great massacre of the people who hate the Jews. And that's really the irony of the entire story. It goes on to the 14th as well, and then more people are defended, and the haters of the Jews are outed and killed. And in the end, at the end of that, it's declared a holiday across the entire country of Persia, and it is declared a holiday for the Jews to this very day. Today, the day I'm recording this, is the first day of the 2 days of celebration for this particular story. Today is a day of fasting, tomorrow is a day of feasting, just like they did here, because in this holiday in the story, there was feasting, there was gladness, there was gifts of food, there were gifts to the poor. I mean, it just really, it's a very nice end all around. Well, that's the end of the story. But there's something that I didn't tell you in the story, which is what makes this story so powerful and so memorable. Remember that point early in the story where I said that Mordecai had heard of the plot and the edict to kill all the Jews? Well, when he sent word and when he sent a note back into the palace, into Hadassah, Hadassah gets this note and realizes that what he is asking her to do with the king could get her killed. And why? Well, this is exactly what she says back to him. This is her response back to Mordecai after he pleads with her to plead on the behalf of all her people. This is what she says. All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law: to be put to death. Well, except for the one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter so that he may live. So she knows that if she just busts into the presence of the king, he has the right to say, "Woman, you should not be here," and kill her. And maybe have another beauty pageant. I don't know. So she realizes this could imperil her life. This is not something that's small. She sends this word back to Mordecai, who's outside the gate, and says, "This could cost me my life. This could cost me my life. And I'm the queen." And it's his response which makes one of the two most powerful, memorable statements in the entire Old Testament as he responds back to Hadassah. He says, even though you're in the court of the king and you're the queen, he says, "And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this." For such a time as this. That is, maybe the entire success of your life in becoming queen in the king's court, maybe it all comes down to this one action. Are you willing to bank your entire purpose for being, like, why am I still here, on this one action on behalf of your people? Maybe you are in the king's court for such a time as this. And then she reads that, and she writes another note, sends it back to her cousin Mordecai, who's pleading with her to act on the behalf of her people. And she writes back and she says this: "Go, gather all the Jews to be found in Susa," that's the town they're in, "and hold a fast on my behalf, and do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. And I and my young women will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish." Probably the second most famous line in the entire Old Testament. Mordecai says to her, "Maybe you have been born for this. Maybe God has put you here for this very purpose." And she agrees and says, "Well, if I perish, I perish, but I have to do this." So it answers the basic question, why are we here? Could it be that God is still saving you for an event still to come in the future, just like Hadassah, where he can change something of huge intent that you will never see coming, and you may only ever see in retrospect? Maybe it's that powerful, and that's the providence of God. It can be, in fact, that powerful in all that we do. You just don't know what God has in store for you or why he's left you here. But we know that in the case of Hadassah, he made her beautiful. He got her in the right place in the right time. He had the king love her, and the purpose for that was that she could be of unlimited resource to God to save his people. Really, seriously, at this point in the history of time, if she had not done this, it could very well have been the end of the nation of Israel altogether, because it's out in the boonies and they're not at home. It could have been the end of all Israel, and it could have been the end of the bloodline which needed to come to the Messiah, Jesus. She is at a pivotal point in all of history. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. Can a young woman, who is a woman to start with, which makes her a second-class citizen, who is in exile in a foreign country, who has no parents to speak for her anymore, all she has is her cousin Mordecai, and all she has is her beauty, can God use something that small and that insignificant to save an entire nation? And of course the answer is yes. That is exactly what he did. So when we walk around in the places where we're at and we wonder, why does God still have me here? What can I really do? I can't have any pivotal role. In your own estimation, that's true. None of us know what we can really do or not do. I mean, we are in such insignificant positions. But what we don't see is the picture on the other side of the providence of God. He sees the entire outlay of history and time, and he has a time and a place for you. So that maybe even as early as tomorrow, you may be faced with something or a circumstance that will take some courage to follow through with, and the words that Mordecai had said to Hadassah will come back to your mind. Hey, maybe you're here for such a time just as this. And if it costs you a lot, like it would have for Hadassah, you might have to say at the same time, well, if I perish, I perish. But my purpose from God is this point for such a time as this. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. You know, if you want to read the story yourself, and I recommend that you do, it's in the Old Testament, but it's not the book of Hadassah, it's the book of Esther. It's the book of Esther. Hadassah is her Hebrew name, but the Persian name that was given to her was Esther. And in the book of Esther, we find out about someone who looks like they can't change anything in history, but because they are obedient to the providence of God and who put their interests second to those of God's interests and the interests of God's people, and admit out loud, if I perish, I perish, but this I do according to God's leading. And amazing things might happen because you're willing to recognize that where you are right now and how God has prepared you for this moment is not an accident. It's not an accident. Maybe you exist for such a time as this. Great story. Go read Esther. It's awesome. And it gives you more reason to even read the Old Testament narratives because they're just incredibly good. Incredibly good. Well, I'll be back next week and we will pick up and start the life of Elisha. I'm looking really forward to that. So we'll see you then. And I trust that you'll make use of your time. And again, if you have a Hadassah/Esther story between now and then, make sure you tell us. So this is me signing off. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next week.